There is a major shift quietly happening in the war in Ukraine right now, and interestingly, it is something that many people haven't fully noticed yet. But if you look closely at what's happening on the battlefield, this shift could end up being one of the most significant turning points of the entire war. This change hasn't appeared overnight. It has been developing slowly for some time, but recently, several developments have accelerated the trend. One of the most important developments is Russia losing access to Starlink. That single update alone has the potential to reshape how the war is fought. But the shift I'm talking about today goes even deeper than that, because Ukraine is now beginning to move onto the offensive. Not in the way many people expected, not with massive armored breakthroughs or huge troop advances. Instead, Ukraine is going on the offensive in a very different way. And if you're not paying attention to the details, it's very easy to miss. But when you step back and look at the bigger picture, what's happening right now could represent a tipping point in how this war is conducted. Now, to understand why this matters so much, we need to look at how the war has been fought up to this point. For most of the war in Ukraine, the battlefield dynamic has been very clear. Russia chooses the attack, Ukraine responds to it. That pattern has defined the conflict for years. Russia decides where to launch assaults, where to push forward, and where to concentrate troops. Then Ukraine builds defensive positions and focuses on stopping those assaults. Over time, Ukraine became extremely effective at this strategy. One of the biggest reasons is drone warfare. Drones have transformed the battlefield in Ukraine, and they allow defenders to see enemy movements, track soldiers, and strike targets with precision. Because of this, the front lines have become incredibly difficult to break. Russia might make slow and costly gains in certain areas, but those gains are often very small and extremely expensive. In many cases, the territory captured doesn't even have major strategic value. And the reason is simple. Ukraine has become very good at stopping Russian advances, but something important has started to happen recently. Ukraine has gotten so effective at defending that it now has resources left over after stopping Russian attacks. Think about that for a moment. At the beginning of the war, Ukraine had to dedicate nearly everything to survival. Every drone, every artillery round, every defensive position, everything went into holding the line. But now, that situation is starting to change. Ukraine is stopping Russian assaults more efficiently, and that means fewer resources are required just to maintain the defense. Those extra resources are now being used for something new. Ukraine is beginning to hunt Russian forces behind the front lines. Instead of only targeting soldiers when they attack Ukrainian positions, Ukraine is now increasingly striking them before they ever reach the battlefield. This includes targeting Russian supply areas, frontline staging bases, reconnaissance equipment, logistics vehicles, and troop gathering points. In other words, Ukraine is hitting Russian forces where they think they are safe. Now, this type of attack isn't completely new. Ukraine has always taken opportunities to strike behind Russian lines when possible. But what's changing now is the scale. These strikes are becoming more frequent, more organized, and increasingly part of Ukraine's core strategy. Instead of waiting for opportunities, Ukraine is now actively searching for them. So what caused this shift? There are several factors, and they are all coming together at the same time. First, Russia is simply becoming exhausted by the war. After years of continuous fighting, Russia has fewer resources available for constant assaults. Fewer soldiers, fewer weapons, fewer large-scale offensive operations. Because of this, Russia has had to reduce the number of attacks it launches. That reduction immediately lowers pressure on Ukrainian defenses. And that gives Ukraine more freedom to redirect its own resources. And at the same time, Ukraine has been dramatically increasing its drone production. This has been happening for a while, but the results are now becoming very clear. Ukraine is producing drones at such a high rate that there is rarely a shortage anymore. That is a massive change from earlier in the war. Previously, drone operators had to be extremely careful about when they use drones. Every mission had to be carefully considered. But now Ukraine has surplus drones. And when you have a surplus of something in war, you can start taking more initiative. You can go on the offensive, you can search for targets, you can strike deeper. But there's another important factor here as well: experience. Ukraine's drone operators now have years of battlefield experience. These pilots have been trained through advanced programs, and many of them have conducted hundreds of missions. That experience dramatically increases efficiency. More experience means better targeting and better coordination and better results. When you combine plenty of drones with highly experienced operators, you create a very powerful capability. But technology has also expanded what drones can actually do. One of the biggest technological changes is range. Earlier in the war, many drones were limited to relatively short distances from their operators. But today, drones can now conduct medium-range strikes of around 100 kilometers. That distance opens up entirely new possibilities. Positions that used to be considered safe are no longer safe. Bases located far behind the front lines are now within reach. Supply hubs that once operated without fear can now be targeted, and this dramatically increases Ukraine's ability to disrupt Russian operations. When you combine all of these factors together, you get what can only be described as a perfect storm. Russia is conducting fewer assaults. Ukraine has more drones, Ukrainian drone operators are more experienced, and drones can now reach deeper targets. The result is a domino effect. The fewer attacks Russia launches, the fewer resources Ukraine needs for defense. The fewer resources Ukraine needs for defense, the more resources it can use for offensive drone operations. Those offensive operations then weaken Russian forces before they attack, which makes future Russian attacks even weaker, and that makes them even easier to stop, which again frees up even more Ukrainian resources. You can see how this cycle begins to feed itself. The gap slowly grows wider, and that widening gap is exactly what we're starting to see now. Now, here's something interesting. This development probably doesn't surprise Russia. In fact, Russia likely feared this scenario from the beginning. If you've watched the war closely, you might have noticed something. Russia has been extremely relentless in its attacks, even when those attacks seemed extremely costly. Even when the gains were minimal. Why? Because Russia likely understood something very important. If they ever slowed down and gave Ukraine time to breathe, Ukraine could start accumulating advantages. More equipment, more training, more production, more experience, and eventually those advantages could allow Ukraine to do exactly what it's starting to do now. This is why Russia maintained constant pressure. It wasn't necessarily because it was the best strategy. It may have been because it was the only strategy available to prevent Ukraine from gaining momentum. Russia also tried to pressure Ukraine politically by discouraging international support, by attempting to weaken aid, and by trying to create moments where Ukraine might run out of resources. But despite those efforts, Ukraine has continued to adapt, and now we are seeing the results. Ukraine's war of attrition strategy is beginning to show real effects. Russian forces are starting to feel the consequences. One of the clearest signs is what's happening with logistics. Ukraine is increasingly targeting supply routes behind the front lines. This means fewer supplies are reaching Russian soldiers, less ammunition, less equipment, and sometimes even less food. Some recent footage from the battlefield has shown Russian soldiers who appear physically exhausted and undersupplied. Not just tired from combat, but genuinely lacking basic resources. And that creates a serious problem for any military, because warfare isn't just about weapons. It's about energy, endurance, and logistics. A soldier who hasn't eaten enough or hasn't received proper supplies is not going to perform at the same level. Now, add another major factor into this situation: Russia's loss of Starlink access. Starlink has played an enormous role in battlefield communication during this war. Reliable communication allows units to coordinate movements, share intelligence, and respond quickly to threats. When communication systems break down, confusion spreads rapidly. Units struggle to coordinate. Orders take longer to reach the front lines, and responses become slower and less effective. So Russia losing access to Starlink creates another disadvantage. It weakens coordination at the exact moment when Ukraine is increasing pressure behind the lines. And there's another consequence as well. Ukraine previously had to spend time and resources targeting Starlink relays and equipment used by Russian forces. But if Russia no longer has access to those systems, Ukraine can redirect those efforts toward other targets. That means drones can focus on more valuable objectives. Supply routes, command positions, equipment depots, all of this increases the overall efficiency of Ukraine's operations. And again, this creates another domino effect. More successful strikes weaken Russian assaults. Weaker assaults require fewer Ukrainian defensive resources, and those freed resources can be used for even more strikes. Another important outcome of Russia's communication problems is chaos among frontline units. Without reliable communication, organizing large assaults becomes much harder. Commanders struggle to coordinate multiple units, and mistakes become more common. This situation allows Ukraine to begin influencing where battles take place. By concentrating drone attacks in specific areas, Ukraine can weaken certain sections of the Russian line. That doesn't mean Ukraine will suddenly launch a massive ground offensive tomorrow. Large-scale offensives require enormous preparation. But what Ukraine can do right now is shape the battlefield. They can weaken key areas, disrupt supply networks, and gradually create opportunities for future operations. And this fits perfectly with Ukraine's long-term strategy. Ukraine has been fighting a war of attrition, a strategy based on gradually exhausting the enemy over time. That strategy is now beginning to show clear results. Instead of rushing into risky offensives, Ukraine appears to be increasing the rate of attrition, slowly wearing down Russian capabilities, reducing their resources, and weakening their ability to sustain large-scale attacks. Over time, this process could eventually create opportunities for Ukraine to reclaim territory. Even if that process takes time, many people have assumed Ukraine cannot win back land, but Ukraine itself has never accepted that idea, and the strategy we're seeing now helps explain why. In a long war of attrition, small advantages accumulate, slowly, gradually, until eventually the balance begins to shift. One of the best ways to understand this process is through a simple example. Imagine a crack forming in a dam. At first it looks small, almost harmless, just a thin line where a little water begins to leak through. But water is powerful. The pressure keeps building. That tiny crack slowly grows wider and wider until the structure can no longer hold the pressure. Eventually, the dam doesn't just leak, it breaks open, and once that happens, the water rushes through with unstoppable force. That's the kind of dynamic we may be starting to see in this war. For a long time, the battlefield looked locked in place, but small shifts, small cracks in Russia's ability to sustain the war are beginning to appear. And if those cracks continue to widen, the entire balance of the conflict could start changing much faster than people expect. What we're seeing right now might only be the beginning of that process. And that's why this moment is so important. Not because the war is ending tomorrow, but because the direction of the war may be changing. Ukraine's patience, Ukraine's persistence, and Ukraine's long-term strategy may finally be starting to pay off. And that is something worth watching very closely as this conflict continues to evolve.